This podcast is recorded on the 6th of May 2022. The situation in and around Ukraine is developing at an extreme pace. Russia is still at war with Ukraine, but most hostilities are now taking place in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine, near the border of the two countries. In terms of migration, which is what we at ICMPD are dealing with, we see the following development. 5.7 million people have left the country since the start of the war, and even more are internally displaced. This makes it the fastest growing displacement crisis that Europe has witnessed since World War II. Once those people fleeing the war are in relative safety in neighboring countries, the question arises how their integration will look like in the short, medium and long term. So today we will be talking about the integration of refugees from Ukraine in the EU, its challenges for both people and receiving countries. My name is Elisabeth Minkow and you're listening to the ICMPD Migration Podcast. In order to shed light on the challenges for both refugees and EU countries, I have two guests with me who are very familiar with the topic and have closely monitored the situation in and around Ukraine for the last months. Justyna Seges Frelak, a Senior Policy Advisor for Legal Migration and Integration at ICMPD, is my guest today. Welcome, Justyna.
Hello.
And our second guest is Caitlin Katsiaficas, Policy Analyst at ICMPD. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Let's dive right in. Recently, you published an article where you give an overview of all the factors that concern the integration of Ukrainian refugees. Can you give us a summary? What are the biggest challenges in the current situation?
Okay. So what we see right now in the main destination countries is that refugees usually go to the biggest agglomerations or prefer to stay close to the border. As a result, many big cities in countries like Poland or Czech Republic have reached their capacities. To give you some concrete examples, in case of Poland, Ukrainian refugees and those who had migrated before constitute around 20% of population of Krakow or Warsaw. I'm mentioning this concentration because that creates huge issues when it comes to accommodation and housing. Housing is becoming really critical challenge that should be addressed because it's obvious, without a place to live, no one thinks about education, no one thinks about work. So what we've seen is that many cities actually moved to ready reception centers, others rely on hotels or guest houses. In Slovakia, again in Poland, authorities are offering some money to private owners who host people from Ukraine. So here, private sector, private citizens are stepping up to offer support. But this is critical in the first days after people arrive, in first weeks after the arrival. But it's not sustainable. There is a real need for more sustainable, more strategic solutions when it comes to short and long-term housing needs.
Another key immediate issue is regarding temporary protection. And I know our colleague spoke about the triggering of the Temporary Protection Directive in a previous podcast, but this is really important because temporary protection provides quick access to essential integration-related services, including education, housing, as Justyna mentioned, and healthcare, and it gives the right to work as well. And so we know from past experience that acting early is really key to supporting successful inclusion. So registering for this temporary protection is an immediate need for newcomers, and an average of around 300,000 people fleeing Ukraine are applying for temporary protection each week in an EU country, Norway or Switzerland. And by the last week in April, 2.3 million had registered for temporary protection, according to the EU Asylum Agency. So this is roughly 44% of those who left.
Why is there such a gap between those who left and the ones who have registered? Is there any explanation for that?
I think partly is just that this is a big bureaucratic undertaking to register so many people so quickly. Another question is whether people will decide to apply for asylum instead of temporary protection. Temporary protection is faster, of course. Right now, I believe it's most people are able to stay for around 1 year and it's renewable. Mm-hmm. So I think people perhaps are weighing their options. I think another reason could be just dealing with so many things when you're first arriving. Maybe it takes you a little time to go through the steps. But that's a good question. That's something we'll continue to be looking at.
Okay.
Anything you want to add, Justyna?
Yeah, I mean, Caitlin, you mentioned that they haven't taken the final decisions yet. So someone arrived to Poland, to Rzeszów, a city nearby Ukraine, and is now thinking whether I should stay here in Rzeszów or maybe I should move to Berlin or even further because my family is actually in Portugal, but I don't know Portuguese. So this is, and they still have a right to do it. It's 90 days to take the decision before registration. Another issue is that those who have registered already had to do it because of education, enrolling kids, necessity to get social support, etc. Others are waiting.
Okay, let's move on now. Who is it that is actually coming? What are the main statistical average differences compared to the refugees that fled Syria and came to Europe in 2015?
Current arrivals are indeed unique. If we compare them with previous arrivals, it's mostly women, children, many children below 14, and elderly people. So that's the big distinction. Why is this situation? Because Ukrainian men cannot leave because they have to fight. To give you some concrete examples, when we look at registrations in Poland, it's actually women and children constitute 90% of all registrations. So it's close to 100%. It's worth mentioning here, because we keep on saying Ukrainian refugees, that it's not only Ukrainian citizens who are coming. It's also refugees, asylum seekers who lived in Ukraine when war started. It's many international students from Africa or Asia. It's also economic migrants that are coming.
And what happens to those? Maybe Caitlin, what happens to those other migrants that are non-Ukrainians? Because I believe there are some differences in how they're treated, right?
Yes. So in the first days, we did see media reports that non-Ukrainian nationals, some of them, were having difficulties crossing into the EU. I think in the medium and longer term, the question is now whether students, workers, refugees, asylum seekers who were previously in Ukraine, whether they decide they would like to try to stay in the EU, in which case the Temporary Protection Directive may cover them. It depends on the member state and how they implement the directive, or they could try to find other options such as applying for asylum to stay. Or the other question, of course, the other option is whether they wish to return to their home country to take up a job or study there as well. So it's definitely something important to keep in mind in our discussion today. But of course, I would say the majority of people coming are Ukrainian nationals right now that we see.
Right.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention as we talk about who's coming and where they're going. Justyna mentioned earlier a bit the decision-making, do I wish to stay or move on? What's rather unique here is that Ukrainians enjoyed visa-free travel prior to the conflicts, and this visa-free regime and the Temporary Protection Directive allow Ukrainians to choose in which member state they'd like to live, so they can join their networks, make use of their language skills, follow job opportunities. So we see, as Justyna mentioned, that most are staying in neighboring countries, but that member states that already had sizable Ukrainian communities before the war are also seeing larger numbers of newcomers from the country and some other countries as well.
And that's probably something that has been the case for other refugee movements as well?
A lot of people do want to join their networks or of course, go somewhere where they have options for a more sustainable future. But actually in Europe, it can be quite difficult. This is something we were looking at from one of our research projects, TRAFIG, Transnational Figurations of Displacement, this 3-year EU-funded research project. We're now coming to a close. And we did see in Europe and in other regions we studied that a lot of displaced people do have connections, whether it's locally, nationally, or transnationally even. And they do often want to join family or friends. And sometimes these family and friends are able to offer logistical, emotional, or financial support, but many times they're not able to move across countries, even if they're already in the EU, and even if they already have refugee status. So this actually, what we see now is something that we were looking at in the project. Approach that we recommended was that we would like to see more mobility and more people being allowed to join their networks to have these sustainable futures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You've already mentioned housing as a key concern. Employment is another major concern if you look at the mid and long-term integration efforts. So looking at the current labor market in the EU, what are the prospects for Ukrainians, Justyna?
Mm-hmm. Employers in a number of member states, especially in the frontline countries, remain rather optimistic regarding the absorption capacities of local labor markets. But I would say that it's easier said than done. Why? Because labor market shortages might mean that there are more opportunities, that's for sure. However, and we mentioned that already, not everyone might be able to enter labor market so easily. It's female refugees. Many of them are sole caregivers of their children, meaning that proper childcare, but also elderly care in many cases might be a precondition of successful integration into the labor market. On one hand, the high levels of education of Ukrainian population in general, but also the proximity of Ukrainian education system to EU might mean that the integration would be easier. However, we have language barriers because, of course, in Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, it might be easier to learn the language. In Lithuania, Latvia, maybe they can use simply Russian, but it's not the case in Germany or Spain. So it's language barriers, but it's also the profile of people who are coming, because what we observe is that the skills labor shortages in each member states are very specific. So it means that these people might simply do not match the demand on the side of employers.
Do you have any good practices for labor market integration of refugees?
Sure. I think it's interesting that especially since 2015, Europe has recognized the importance of validating the skills that refugees have quickly and early on. So recognizing the foreign qualifications so that they're able to capitalize on their skills in European labor markets and also meet labor needs here in Europe. And so, for instance, Sweden implemented fast-track programs to speed up access to the labor market for immigrants arriving who were filling jobs in industries with labor shortages. So, for instance, social workers, teachers, chefs. So these combined job-related language training, early skills assessments, recognition of credentials, guidance about further training and study, and job matching. We also saw increased flexibility during the COVID-19 pandemic when several countries relaxed travel restrictions or credential requirements to meet the need for essential workers in healthcare and agriculture in particular. So these approaches can provide inspiration, I think, for the current situation, and this is something that we're currently looking at here at ICMPD. It's also interesting to see, the 2015-16 spike in arrivals and the pandemic both spurred the adoption of these more flexible approaches, and we do already see this again in the face of large-scale displacement to the EU now. So Poland, for instance, now gives doctors or dentists from Ukraine a conditional license to practice a medical profession without full recognition of their diploma. And in Lithuania, Ukrainian teachers can teach for 2 years without needing to be able to teach in Lithuanian language. So these measures are important not only for helping newcomers earn a living, they're also important for meeting labor needs and receiving economies and communities. In some cases, like with the Ukrainian teachers in Lithuania, they can help scale up services for newcomers by contributing their language skills alongside other experience they have, but their impact also goes beyond this.
Does that mean, on the other hand, that the EU overall is now better prepared to host this large number of refugees than they used to be? Did the EU learn from past experiences from your perspective?
I think these fast tracks, for instance, and these flexible approaches are indicative of the progress that has been made and the lessons, I think, learned from the past. So I think it's also good that Europe is acting so quickly with the Temporary Protection Directive. I think that's a very, very good sign. Of course, there's always challenges moving, and moving your life to a new place is always a challenge. But I think it's a promising start for sure.
There is, of course, but Caitlin, you mentioned that indeed there is a huge amount of experience, huge amount of practical knowledge in the member states. However, it's not all member states that have this knowledge, because not all of them experience large inflows. Not all of them integrated huge numbers of migrants and refugees before. So that's the situation that we face now. Frontline countries have limited experience with integration, and whereas they've been working on a comprehensive migration policies, there is still a lot to improve and learn when it comes to integration. Another issue, because Caitlin mentioned good practices, is that we are good in producing good or best practices, but there is also an issue of transferability. So this is what we have to still learn, how to learn from each other. And this is actually another project called Spring that ICMPD is now working on. We want to take a stock of what we learned, what we know, and actually how to share it with others.
That sounds very promising. I have another question regarding diaspora and how they are actually adding to the integration of Ukrainian refugees these days. Do you have any experience with that group, let's say?
What we see is that indeed diaspora organizations, diaspora members are extremely active when it comes to humanitarian support directly in Ukraine, but also in the area of reception of newcomers. And indeed, in case of Ukrainian citizens, the community is huge. For example, in Poland, according to various statistics, there were around 1 million or even more than 1 million people living. So it's like a huge potential that should be untapped even more, I think.
Also a bit related to this, culturally, is it from your experience, and also maybe there are best practices already or some research has been done on this, we see now that the acceptance of Ukrainian refugees is much, much higher than it used to be in Europe in 2016, 15 and 16, but also maybe if you look further down history, there have been always issues with the reception and the sort of welcoming culture of refugees. And it looks, at least at the moment, as if this is now changing, or it has changed for Ukrainians. Is this also what you have observed? Can you confirm this? And are there any indicators to consider when it comes to acceptance from the locals, of the foreigners, so to speak, that one has to consider looking at this whole process long term?
I actually checked the most recent opinion polls about attitudes to Ukrainian refugees. So actually, according to Ipsos survey, around 3/4 of respondents globally agree that their country should take in Ukrainian refugees. And agreement is high both in countries that experience huge inflows and those that do not observe many arrivals yet. So that's very interesting compared to previous situations, and indeed the question remains: how long can we expect such positive attitudes? But it's not only about attitudes, it's actually about action, because it's a really widespread mobilization of people, not only grassroots organizations. They are actually new grassroots movements that were created just to support this group. So I mentioned civil society, local authorities. So it's very unique also because it doesn't concern just one country or one region, but it's a whole Europe or even beyond.
Just to echo what Justyna was saying, I think this support really does extend beyond Europe. So looking globally, Canada has been very quick to respond, offering a variety of different pathways for people coming from Ukraine, whether it's family reunification or community sponsorship, coming to emergency travel authorization. In South America, Brazil and Argentina are offering humanitarian visas. The U.S. has created a new temporary parole program, and we see also Israel, Australia, New Zealand, a variety of different countries taking these steps, I think much more quickly and also larger in scale and times than usual to welcome people as well. And again, a lot of these programs are mobilizing family and diaspora connections, also just public support. But again, here, the public support and whether it will last over time is something that we need to think about, and we'll see how that goes.
Is this something that governments would have to invest into now, if you could make a suggestion, let's say?
I think something that came up in our research for Traffic, which again looked at networks, found that this local networking was a really important strategy, whether it's among refugees or between refugees and locals in receiving communities. And finding spaces for interaction was something that really helped to build these relationships and to turn them from a passing interaction into a friendship or something that's a tie that really was stronger. So I think it can be a variety of things, from urban planning and finding ways that people interact more frequently, or it can also be intentional programs such as education courses, dinner conversations, all these different things for governments and NGOs that provide a space for people to do something together, to learn together, to interact together, and to build those relationships.
And that all should be done within complex, holistic integration policies, because I mentioned already that it's still an area that should be further developed in a number of countries, because you cannot put everything on the shoulders of civil society or private citizens. At some point, even for coordination reasons, authorities have to step in.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned education also as a means for integration. If we look then again at the numbers of minors arriving, how do EU member states now tackle the issue of education of both children but maybe also students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important question. School-age children do make up a large share of people coming, as was mentioned, and they're arriving in the middle of the school year. So right now, for instance, there are almost 200,000 Ukrainian children in Polish schools. So refugee children often face difficulty beyond simply doing their homework, including adjusting to a new school, dealing with language barriers, coping with trauma, and navigating curriculum differences. And teachers can often use more training to address these challenges. So it includes registration in school, but it's definitely much more beyond this. So member states right now are enrolling children in mainstream education systems. So Poland, for instance, is creating special classes for Ukrainian children to transition into Polish classrooms, and many countries are seeking to hire Ukrainian-speaking staff as well. I mentioned Lithuania's flexibility for Ukrainian teachers already, and in Poland, Ukrainian teachers can work as teachers' assistants or multicultural assistants without needing to have their credentials recognized first. So that's important to scaling up services for Ukrainian-speaking students while they also learn the local language. It's also interesting to see that some Ukrainian students in the EU are engaging in distance learning with educational institutions in Ukraine. And of course, many of us have become familiar with remote learning during the pandemic. Looking also at the youngest children who are not yet school age, early education and care can support language skills and other elements of children's development and school readiness. And these programs are also important for enabling mothers to take up a job.
Is there enough space for everybody at this point?
I can refer to the Polish case because this is the country I'm closely monitoring. So I would say that yes, there is enough space, but there is a still urgent need to improve or increase this targeted support. Mm-hmm. And this is what is being done, for example, through involvement of cultural assistants or assistants to Polish teachers. But yeah, this is a huge capacity issue. So I would say yes, everyone who is registered has a place at school, but then what happens afterwards? That's the question mark.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So are there any initiatives already? I mean, you mentioned something was in the Baltic states, I think, where Ukrainians can work also as teachers. And do you know of any other initiatives that concern educational systems, be it kindergarten or schools or universities, where Ukrainians themselves are hired as sort of bridge builders?
I definitely think this is a strategy a lot of countries are looking at right now, how to hire teachers with the needed language skills to be working with children before they're proficient in the local language. And I think here, those coming from Ukraine now, this year, in addition, I guess, to those who are already in these countries previously, before the war, who speak Ukrainian, they're definitely being looked to take up these jobs. And I think that's also why we see the flexibility with the credentials right now, because there is this real interest in getting people working in schools as soon as possible.
Okay, that sounds like a great opportunity. You also mentioned very briefly mental health. How important, or do you already have any estimations of how many people need mental health support? Is this something that the hosting countries are looking at? And do you have any info on this basically at this point?
Sure. Well, I can speak, I guess, generally to the issue of mental health and well-being, which of course is essential for when we talk about displacement context. So with the invasion of Ukraine, people's lives were upended literally overnight. As we saw in the headlines, the journeys that people are undertaking to leave Ukraine are arduous, some waiting as many as 60 hours in the freezing cold. Lines are many kilometers long, perhaps, to cross the border. And meanwhile, with most men required to remain in Ukraine, as Justyna mentioned, families are separated and fearing for the safety of their loved ones. So these very stressful situations are reasons why mental health and psychosocial support are a key component of humanitarian interventions, and why they should also be part of integration approaches as well. So research actually suggests a bidirectional relationship between mental health and integration, meaning that supporting mental health may also support integration trajectories. So while mental health is, of course, important in its own right, it can also support efforts to foster inclusion. But that's not to say that everyone will need professional mental health treatment. The majority of refugees do not. But it will be important to provide a sense of safety, welcoming, and support in receiving communities, including meeting basic needs, which the Temporary Protection Directive, of course, aims to do. Language classes, employment, and housing are also important here. And providing support in schools and for parents as well as their children will also be useful approaches. And of course, for those who will need more specialized mental health services, these must be available and accessible. Mm-hmm. And that is something that was challenging, I would say, even before the pandemic and even before.
If I may jump in, the psychological support is interestingly a part of one of our projects, a project in Poland that is now supporting vulnerable groups, and of course almost all people coming from Ukraine belong to vulnerable groups. So actually our partners in Poland have a network of therapists supporting people who are arriving.
And what do they report? Again, do they have sufficient capacity to serve to the needs of the traumatized refugees?
It's always a drop in the ocean. On one hand, of course, not everyone needs long-term therapy. It's more like related to the crisis situation, and this is where this psychologists are the most involved. But of course, there are more difficult cases, and there, of course, it's not enough what is being done, but it's I suppose not enough in any country, because that's the type of support that I would not say is luxurious, but it's difficult to access.
I would say as accessing mental health services can be challenging for the general population. There's often not enough services to meet the need, and that can be increasingly difficult for people who speak different languages or come from other places.
Also related to this, when people are arriving and they are in those centers for refugees, do you think that they get sufficient information on where to access and how to proceed generally, how to set up their lives in the receiving country? Or do you think that there is some kind of gap still persisting that has to be closed in terms of really information transfer?
What we observe right now is that many people actually connect with their networks of family and friends, and they are the main source of information. However, there is a growing number of people who do not have any contacts in Europe, for example, and these people are then directed to the reception center, where information is also provided.
I would say there have been several efforts to kind of consolidate information, and I know the EU, for instance, has an information page where those leaving Ukraine or who have already left can find a lot of resources, not just about the directive, but about different organizations in different member states who are helping people. I would say also, we mentioned already the public support that we've seen and the variety of initiatives, whether it's government-led NGOs, private citizens offering flats, etc. And it's really great, but at the same time, I think it can be difficult then to consolidate all of this great work in one place. And I think that's the challenge, first to have this mapping of everything going on, but also to make sure that the people who need to know do know where to find the information. Always a challenge.
One thing we haven't talked about yet at all is the financial situations of refugees. So not all of the ones that arrive are necessarily rich, not necessarily poor either, but also not everybody necessarily has been to Europe before and knows how the European financial systems work. What are your observations on generally the topic of finances for refugees?
Sure. So we've already covered employment and public services, public benefits that will be available to those with temporary protection. But I think, yes, like you mentioned, access to personal financial resources is another part of the equation. And we have seen, at least in the first weeks of the conflict, these challenges that people were facing, converting currency, their currency into euros once they arrived in the EU. So, of course, that makes it difficult to settle in if you need to be able to afford various things that you need.
Another very specific challenge that we see is that it tends to be difficult in some countries to open bank account. And we know that nowadays you cannot function without bank account. So I know that some financial institutions are right now working on easing the access to these services.
Okay. At the very end, I have a rather speculative and personal question. What do you expect culturally from Ukrainians who came now in masses to Europe? What kind of, sort of cultural change or impact do you expect the Ukrainians to make?
I'm originally from Warsaw, Poland. and my country used to be very, very homogeneous. So basically Poland for Polish people only. And for me, it's amazing how it has been changing recently with arrivals from not only Ukraine, but also many other countries. So right now, for me, when I'm in Warsaw, I finally see that it's a multi-culti city, and that's amazing.
Cool. And how about you, Caitlin?
Yes, I think something similar. Coming from the US, I think I really value the cultural, among other contributions that immigrants and refugees bring. So I'm sure it will be the same here, and looking forward to the cultural richness that will be added.
Okay, let's hope so. At least there's maybe some positive outcome of this awful situation altogether. Thanks a lot, Caitlin and Justyna, for being here with me. We learned a lot about both challenges of refugees, the challenges of the EU, but also about, maybe surprisingly for some, the progress that has been made in comparison to other refugee situations that the EU has faced, maybe in the last even 10 or 15 years. So this is overall not a bad improvement for the EU. As always, many thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Stay with us and listen to our other podcasts. Follow us on social media, and see you next time. Stay up to date on ICMPD's activities and visit our website icmpd.org, sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media.